original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we are. Look at that. The 18th day of July, 2023. Feeling like July these days. It's kind of nice. It's not too freaking hot. Not too humid. Although there'll be those who might be, complaining about it one way or the other. Have at it. I think the summers are way too short in this part of the world to be complaining about it. And I'm not dismissing any of the issues that certainly we're facing. The heat waves in Europe and I guess Northwest Africa. It's just been insane. And the next heat wave that comes along, I learned the forecasters are calling it Karen after the ferryman of Hades. A little hot there. So that's just been the nature of the beast of this summer. So we'll watch it with interest. The fires, of course, have been an issue in Northern Ontario and Quebec. I understand now British Columbia under more pressure as a result of that. So, again, I get the crisis, but it's nice to be able to step out and feel the sun on, the back of your neck and just kind of enjoy that. I get it. Same time. Let's not be downers on all of this. All right, here we go. It's Now and Next. Dave Trafford here for Story Studio Network, and lots to talk about. And we kind of watch things unfold at City Hall. Now we're a week into the mayoralty of Olivia Chow, so a few things going on there, and I thought we should touch base with Josh Colle, former City Councillor here in Toronto, is the head of the TTC, is the chair of that commission, and recently in Italy. Was it hot?
It was hot.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah.
But I wasn't complaining, but it was hot, so it was great to be away for a bit.
And when you look at that, and you compare it to some of the things that kind of get called out here in the city around, whether or not we should have cooling centers and that sort of thing. Did you get any sense of how the cities in Europe are handling that kind of heat? Because it was like 48 degrees one day in Italy.
Yeah, it's funny. You can't once you're kind of in this world, whether you're an elected official or a public servant or a planner, you kind of can't escape it when you're in other cities. So you're always looking at these things, and your family members kind of either get used to it or just kind of roll their eyes. But yeah, I noticed. I mean, one thing, Rome, for example, and it's super hot. They have so many like water fountains and stations. Like it's just part of their ancient Roman DNA to have that. And so that was noticeable. The other thing that was interesting in a bit of a cooler climate, I ended up in Copenhagen, which is a real urban experiment worth studying. And you always hear about their bike infrastructure and how they've embraced that. The interesting thing there was the way they've kind of unlocked all of their waterfront for a lot of it. They've cleaned their harbor. So a lot of it's just for swimming. So you'll see some people who will just kind of get into their shorts and jump in. And they've got, with not significant investments, they've built up infrastructure where they created kiddie pools and places where people can do laps, or just a jumping platform for all to use, and it's all free. And so the amount of people using those was astounding. And so we often in Toronto have this issue where we're very much divided from our lake, even though a lot of Torontonians who most need access to it, in many cases don't know there's a lake at the south end of the city. But to see what they've done there was just kind of very simple, practical, but got so much use. And it was a nice mix of, free access with commercial opportunities and, kind of more casual stuff with more party vibes. So it was great. So I think our water, my one learning was our water systems, both our rivers and our lakefront, really need to be unlocked, especially as we deal with issues around access to public space and heat, right? Heat issues.
Yeah, I was reading something recently about the situation with the Don River. And there was a day when, that would be a point of recreation for people who lived in the city. It's still a problem at the south end of the river. As you get further north, apparently, it's a little more accessible and acceptable to be if you wanted to actually dip a toe in. But it's funny you should say that, because the idea that, so many people jump in a car on a weekend in this part of the city, part of the world, and they will drive an hour and a half to go somewhere where they can swim.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of water around us here in this part of the world.
And I've seen it in other cities too. A place like Austin, Texas has, it's called Barton Springs, and it's a spring that stays about the same temperature all year and it gets pretty hot there. There it's on one side it's a paid system, on the other side it's not. But again, they just created some docks, some diving platforms, jumping platforms, and go for it. It doesn't have to be like you don't have to overthink it too much. But I would say in Copenhagen there were 7, 8 at least of them in kind of the core, and every one of them was being incredibly well used, just for that other kind of some entertainment or just that some reprieve from the heat. Getting outside of Toronto, as for people like you and I who kind of watch the city and know it and love it so much, is a really good thing for you. It makes you realize that I think sometimes we overthink things a bit in the city. And I've been in the machine, right, at City Hall, and you see it play out with the Cafe TO, and you see it play out with the years-long debate over having a beer in a park, where there's something, I don't know if it's our Puritan roots, but there's something that really inhibits us from just trying things and just being kind of simple and practical. And seeing it done in other places and as different as kind of Rome and Copenhagen tells you it can be done. We can do it.
Well, I wonder whether or not a lot of that has to do with, I say this is sort of a lack of sense of adventure, if you want, even in this city, because we want to do something and we absolutely insist on getting it right away, as opposed to saying, this is a kind of a cool idea. What do you think? And it the problem is we attach the word pilot program to those things, and then it just becomes a bit of sandpaper in the conversation. We just need to kind of start doing things.
We do. And so we are so kind of burdened by our peace, order, and good government kind of sensibility, and I think in Toronto more than other. I work in a lot of Canadian cities now, and I think Toronto, it's the most obvious and intense. And from I think of it from a transit perspective, even. Like there's the kind of the whole concept of, we debate bike lanes and we debate transit dedicated lanes. And there's been lots of writing and practical implemented experience where sometimes the bucket of paint approach is the way to go, because you know what? If it doesn't work, to your point, then it didn't work, but you tried it, right? And in most cases, it probably will work okay, and it'll evolve. So I think, as Toronto needs that, I often wonder if, because of the size of the organization of the city of Toronto, and I'm not, suggesting shrinking government in any way, but you have the expertise, you have the people, you have the ability, you have the sober second thought, and the people who are managing risk, who can come up with, there's always a reason not to do something when you can kind of huddle that many smart people in a room about something. And so you always come up with it, and then you don't do it. I may have told you this before, but I remember when I was a counselor and there's some, issue you're trying to unlock, and I'd walk into a room, on the matter with a bunch of really dedicated, smart public servants. If there were 15 of them in the room, I immediately knew that issue wasn't being solved. There's no risk appetite. There's no ownership. There's no accountability when you do that. And there's always someone who can say, well, what about if, the drinking in the park upsets a family who wants a quiet time, right? When I would walk into a meeting with like 2 people who were kind of senior enough, then I'd be like, okay, might get something done here. And so I think, maybe if I had some advice for an incoming mayor or a new mayor, say like, how do you adopt the culture we embraced during COVID, when we could make things happen really quickly And again, some didn't work and some didn't stay, and that's okay. And we're not really kind of judging anyone by that now. But some worked, right? Like, activating some of our streets for, cafes or bars seemed to kind of work. How can we embrace that? Like, don't call it a pilot, don't call it a trial, but kind of some of that, like embrace some of the innovation, embrace some of the risk, and let's be okay with some of the learnings or failings along the way, because that's what starts to address the issues that are kind of get upsetting people, right? Like, there's some massive structural issues that we can discuss now and for weeks, but some of the ones that get people really upset are the little things, about kind of just managing your life and your day in a big city.
Well, and let's get into some of that, because the question now is, as I said off the top, Olivia Chow, a week into her mayoralty, officially sworn in last week. And the question is, and I ask this with all due respect, is she the mayor we need right now in Toronto? She is the mayor we have, and we have to cheer for her success, because to your point, there's a lot on the table that has to get done. But does she have the capital, politically, culturally, to actually be able to make some of those courageous decisions that you point to and say, we're going to have to do some of this small stuff, big stuff, incremental, whatever it might be, but it's going to take some political courage and capital.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I think she needs to kind of, spell out right away, that, like, we need some of that, and I'm gonna spend it, because of the kind of current moment we're in. I suspect, regardless who would have won this election, no one would have had it in heaps and heaps, just because of the nature of the race, how fractured and split it was, and no one was going to come through with a huge majority. So it will be incumbent on this mayor and anyone who would have been in the seat to probably take on some positions that will spend some of that capital. The great irony with that is, probably you need then strong mayor powers to do that. She, and I give her credit for it, has expressed on being uncomfortable using those. But because of this moment, because of what you and I have just talked about, but then on top of it, just the vote count. Like, the rest of council didn't change. This is a really unique situation, right? Like, we're used to kind of after an election assessing, okay, where are the votes now? None of that changed. Now, conveniently, some councillors can shift pretty quickly, so some will. But I think whether it is the power of her personality, the freshness of her being in the seat and office, her ability to build coalitions, or her willingness to use those powers, it's going to have to be one of those things to do some of what needs to get done.
Yeah, and I think the problem with the strong mayor powers, again, we go back to the perceptions around it, and in the sense that it was sort of done on a handshake and a pat on the back and a closed door meeting, whatever it might have been, that there was something nefarious about it. But it misses the point that there is a problem here, and we need to solve a problem. And what problem are we actually trying to solve? And sometimes it is sort of roadblocks at City Hall are the problems that we need to solve. So we got to drive through them. If she were to use it, that would be great. But it comes down to a lot of the stuff that you've talked about before, that it's low-hanging fruit in some cases, where it's around zoning and regulation, and we're going to have to rethink, for example, how do we consider commercial property in downtown Toronto versus, can we change it to residential? And we could do a whole series on how to do that. But there needs to be some expression of vision there, and it has to happen fast. Yeah,
it really has to happen fast, and she doesn't have the luxury of time that maybe you would in a normal term of council. I'm thinking there's probably two prongs. One is there's just the plain and simple, the system's broken issues, right? And I've cited this before. When you're approaching a $50 billion capital bill, and on day one a $1.5 billion operating bill going into your next budget, like there's no property tax increase or savings that addresses that. Just there's not. So that's one conversation, and one that has to be with the feds in the province, because for the feds in the province, probably a rounding error. The feds in the province can come up with $18 billion for electric battery manufacturing in Southwest Ontario. This should be solvable. But then the other piece of it, which I think, any incoming mayor who's gone through what she just has probably felt on the street. It's all those issues around, like, just can you address some of the stuff to make life easier, kind of navigating the city. And so affordability is a big one that, you can't immediately address, but, just transit being there more readily. All the things you kind of constantly hear about, like, I want to register my kid for a program. Like, we've talked about that for 25 years since amalgamation. It's still, some improvements have been made, but there's still work to be done. So I think there's a suite of just kind of making life better for residents, items that, I would turn my mind to knocking off, kind of one a month over the next, kind of the balance of the term. Because those things people remember and they make a difference in people's lives. The bigger dragon to slay, that's a fight you're still going to have to take on. But while you're doing that, you need to show some progress in other areas.
Yeah, and I think that the progress in other areas has to be evident between now and November, because around November we're going to start to hear all the noise around budget building, and that's when it's going to get.
And it's going to be her budget, right? This is
exactly.
It's going to be her budget. So
even for her to be coy and say, "Well, I don't know what the tax increase will look like until we get to March." No, that's not on. We're going to have to know what that is in November, so that there is a robust debate and a consideration about services and so on. So the short term, I think, is important to your point, in terms of her being able to coalesce council around a couple of these really important. And I don't say that they're not symbolic. They would be important things that would have to happen in the city, right?
Yeah, and I think. And those came up a lot in the lead up to this election, and even in the kind of the quiet, election where John Tory kind of seemed to run unopposed. There was still a conversation around, the literal and emblematic, water fountain that didn't work at the park.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a list of those pain points that I would compile and say, okay, team, we've got the best public servants in the country here. We're going to fix these in the next X amount of weeks or months. Go. No excuses. Let's get it done. I think if you're making progress in that area, it certainly buys you a way more goodwill and earns you some capital that you can expend on the big fundamental issue.
So how do you tackle the larger issues, which will involve other levels of government?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's going to be the forege show there, and I think that's a different ring in the circus. But the other part of this is, it's easy to point to the province and say, well, Toronto is what Toronto is because it's a creature of the province. Except that we have 25 members of Parliament here in Toronto. 23 of them are sitting members of the Liberal caucus, and all 25 ran as Liberals in the last election.
Yeah.
So, how do you play that? Is she making phone calls on the QT to all of these MPs, or does she call them all out and say, where the hell are you? Because, this is your city that is kind of in jeopardy, in crisis. Refugee situation is a really good example of that. Where are you on that?
Yeah, I think it's probably both, right? And probably in the reverse sequence that you laid out the strategies. It's been a weird phenomenon for a while, right? We've had a Liberal government federally now for quite a few years, with the majority of seats in Toronto being held by Liberals. But there needs to be a adult conversation. The systemic issue that Toronto's facing on their fiscal situation is well documented. It's out there. It's in reports. It's not a secret. Obviously not resonating either with residents or with other orders of government. But honestly, the feds and province could fix it tomorrow, and it would not impact their finances significantly. There's probably some politics to it. If I was them, I'd do it secretly. I wouldn't even tell the world I'm doing it. I'd want no ribbon cutting on it. But it's been a tough nut to crack on kind of getting, regardless of political stripes, right? Because this has been the case under, both conservative and liberal governments in Canada, and who've had a mix of seats in Toronto. So she has to bang the drum, and maybe in a way, maybe there's a new approach to it. But I think there's that opportunity to have the really collaborative conversation. But shaming may not be far behind, because it's just that stark, and there is no. So I'll tell you, will Toronto's taxes go up? Yes, they will. For sure, they'll go up. Does the city need to become more efficient? And I'm not talking like that's not code or dog whistle kind of term for shrink government. It's just governments around the world are at an inflection point where they're having to modernize and transform. It's just what it is. They're becoming digital. They're becoming more user-centric. It's changing, right? Like, I always joke that, like, no user is going to line up for a service at City Hall anymore. They're going to expect to do it from their phone on the bus or in bed or whatever it might be. So that's changing. And with that, there's going to be some efficiencies found. And so that has to happen. But you could do a marvelous job at that. You could raise taxes. You can introduce new revenues. It still doesn't address the issue. So I think it's easy for the feds in the province to say that. I wonder, though, and maybe this will be the test that she passes as mayor. I'm wondering if the province and feds are saying, like, show us the pain you felt, the tough decision you've made, for us to be more willing to jump in. So show us the tax increase, show us the service cut, show us a business you've gotten out of, show us something you've sold. And I'm sure current councillors would say, we've done all of that. But I think maybe not in a significant or visible enough way that then you can then say to your other orders of government, okay, we've done our hard part. Can you please step up?
Well, I can see taking that to the extreme. Okay, as of tomorrow, we are out of the business of maintaining the Don Valley Parkway and the Gardiner Expressway. Go for it. We're out of that. We just saved us, hundreds of millions of dollars there.
We're finding it.
That's what we're doing. So all of these places where, we are going to stop funding shelters in these parts of the city, or however it's going to be. We can't afford it anymore, period. There's the pain point, and that's where it's going to touch the provincial government and the federal government. Yeah. At some point, I think in order to have this happen quickly and to be seen to be standing up for Torontonians, I think that's kind of the posture that she needs to take. I don't know if she has the personality to do that, though. And that's not a criticism.
No, I don't know. I mean, it's been a while, right, since we've seen her in action. Mm-hmm. I don't know when she last served as an MP, but I feel like council would have been in the 90s.
Yep. Yes, you're right. That's it.
So,
because then she was an MP into the while I guess Martin was the prime minister. Yeah. So this is a while ago.
So I think we can judge based on that, but maybe not, right? Like, maybe to your point, we don't know because that's a long time ago. And I think she does have the kind of personality, and I think the fact that she has a really strong brand and kind of platform, I think helps with that too. I think that she has the benefit of breaking from the last approach. The previous mayor really kind of prided himself on being this consensus seeker and deal maker. She's not bound by that persona as much because she hasn't been around for a while, and it's not her, right? She can forge whatever is going to be her approach. So I think maybe she does have a bit of leeway in that, in terms of taking the posture you described, if and when it needs to be done.
Well, and I wonder whether or not one of her targets has to be Jagmeet Singh as well, because right now, without him, the Liberal government is not stable at all. Yeah. Given that connection, the NDP roots, everything else. Where are you on this? You got to stand up for
Yeah,
Toronto
that's a
too.
really
So let's do it.
interesting point. And her, the mayor's new chief of staff ran Jagmeet Singh's leadership campaign. So maybe the federal NDP can be the tail a bit that wags that dog through that channel. And hey, if it ends up working that way, what a maybe a fortuitous turn for the city that she's able to pull that lever that maybe the previous mayor couldn't. But yeah, that's that would be a great one to try. And if you're Jagmeet Singh, why not be kind of a city's champion and drive that agenda? Because the Liberals have owned that, whether they've delivered on it or not. They've kind of owned that vote and that that position. Not a bad place, especially if you can extend some of the benefits to, the Hamiltons, the soon-to-be independent Mississaugas and Bramptons. There's something there.
Yeah, well, and there's also the politics in terms of the calculus around it. If not the Liberals in Toronto, then who? Yeah. It would be the NDP. Yeah. It would risk the Liberals in terms of their survival. And I think there's a real path there for her to be able to leverage some of that political momentum and to be able to see, okay, it's not about political stripe. I'm talking to everybody. We're getting this job done. Yeah. And I was the one to do it. Just one thing before we go. And he has been very active on social media lately, up until recently, relatively quiet. But David Miller's posture on Twitter and his sort of ranting about the state of the city, I don't know. Is he out of his lane there? I mean, I get that he's, the former mayor who has some stake and legacy in this city, whether you like it or not. He did some good things for Toronto. We have the Toronto Act on his watch. But it just seems like he's bashing the city at every turn. And I get that he's taking a shot at John Tory and the Fords, but that's not how it comes out.
Yeah, you know what? I think there's that very Canadian expectation, and maybe it's not even Canadian, maybe in all politics, that, you kind of, when you become the elder statesperson after leaving, that's the role you play, and that's the tone and voice you establish. And for a long time, Miller was really quiet. Like, he was not around at all. And I don't know, maybe it's with like distance and age. You're like, I don't care. I know there was some tension when Tory would kind of cite, I remember, what was it? Oh, when Trudeau came as prime minister to City Hall, first prime minister to visit City Hall, Miller and his team was kind of like citing that Paul Martin had been there. I know that when there's claims of like, greatest transit funding increase, and when I was chair, there would be a quick response to saying, well, actually, if you do it per capita in 1990, whatever dollars. So there's probably a bit of that, and that probably started to grind for a while. But I guess there's two paths to go. Like, John Sewell has certainly been the not shy to be that voice.
But John was always like that, even when he was the mayor.
So, you can go the Crombie route, right? And so, maybe Miller is deciding he's okay with the Sewell route. I think the more interesting one will be John Tory's voice, starting today, kind of, or whatever, a week ago. And while I think he will be quiet on the state of affairs, there is inevitably going to be a moment where this new mayor says, wow, it's way worse than we thought. It's a disaster here. Because she has to say that, because she's hamstrung.
That's right.
And it will be a difficult moment for a mayor who had been there for a while, had been popular, who had left when not wanting to kind of stay quiet and want to defend legacy. So there'll be that. And I just also think, Tory and Miller and others, it's just, they're civic animals. You can't turn that off. I mean, as I joked, even from my small perch, how I can't go on vacation and not be looking at civic infrastructure. So I think it's hard, especially when you're the mayor in a city like this where the mayor is so important, to turn that off. And then at a certain point with the platforms we have, and I've stayed away from Twitter since I've left. there's going to be these voices from the I don't want to call them the cheap seats, but from the outside.
On the other ring of the circus. Let's just put it that way. Josh Colle, thanks for being here. It's always good to get your insights on this, and looking forward to seeing you back in the rink soon.
Nice chatting, Dave. We'll talk soon.
Josh Colle is the Senior VP at EY, and of course brings his insights and experience as the former chair at the TTC and at the City Council. And one thing we should actually come back and talk to at some point, he was the chair of the Toronto Music Advisory Council. Right? We'll get into that. All right, that'll do it for now and next here on Story Studio Network. And just a reminder, we are doing the Friday thread. We've got a few things talking about music that we might want to kind of dip into. So be curious to get your thoughts on it. Check out the article we posted on LinkedIn this week about it. And we do a lot of storytelling here in the network, of course. That's Story Studio Network. But using music as part of that storytelling and getting into the stories that songs have, stories that the instruments have. Be curious to know whether or not you'd be interested in that kind of content. You can drop us a line at hello@storystudionetwork.com. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.